There's a specific thing that happens after you've been carrying climate concern for long enough. You stop feeling it, not because you changed your mind, not because the science got less serious, not because the problem quietly resolved itself while you weren't looking. Something else happened. And most content about eco-anxiety will not tell you what that something is, because most content about eco-anxiety is built for people who are still in the feeling, not for people who have come out the other side of it into something colder and harder to name. This video is for the second group, the people who used to feel this acutely, who watched the documentaries, adjusted the habits, had the conversations, carried the weight of it through ordinary days, and who now find themselves in a strange, uncomfortable quiet. Not peace, not resolution, just less. And the question underneath that quiet, the one that's probably been there for a while now, is the concern gone? Or is something else happening? Here is what this video will do. It will give that something else a name. It will show you the 5 specific signs that what you're experiencing is that thing and not something worse. It will explain the mechanism, why this happens, and why it happens specifically to the people who took this seriously. And it will offer the first real steps towards something more sustainable than what broke you, not a return to peak intensity. Something more durable than that. The word burnout gets used loosely. So before getting to the signs, it's worth being precise about what eco-burnout actually is, because precision here matters for what you do next. Eco-burnout is not the same as eco-anxiety. Eco-anxiety is the experience of sustained distress about environmental crisis. The fear, the grief, the moral weight of living inside a problem of this scale. It is painful, but it is alive. It is, in a strange way, a form of connection to what you care about. Eco-burnout is what happens after. It is the depletion that follows sustained, high-intensity engagement with an unresolvable crisis, when the concern has been running at peak pitch for long enough that the system doing the caring has simply run out of fuel. The clinical picture of burnout in any domain involves 3 components: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced sense of personal efficacy. In the eco-specific version, those translate as the numbness where the feeling used to be, the cynicism that replaced the concern, and the private, creeping suspicion that nothing you did or could do actually matters. Here is the thing that most people in this state fear most, the fear that is probably somewhere in the room with you right now. If I burned out, maybe I was never serious. Maybe the concern was performance. Maybe I don't actually care. That fear is understandable. It is also inaccurate. Burnout is not a verdict on the authenticity of what you felt. It is a predictable, mechanistic outcome of a specific error. An error not of character, but of pacing. You were running a sprint engine on a marathon course. The engine was real. The fuel was real. The caring was real. What wasn't calibrated was the distance. This is the distinction that changes what you do next. Because what you do with "I never really cared" and what you do with "I ran the wrong engine for the length of this race" are genuinely different. Hold that distinction. It will matter later. Now to the diagnostic part. 5 signs, each one specific enough that if it applies, you'll know. Sign 1, the relief you feel guilty about. There's a moment. Maybe it's a weekend morning. Maybe it's an evening when the news is off, when you realize you haven't thought about climate in a few hours, and the first thing you feel is not peace. It's relief, followed almost immediately by guilt about the relief. The internal monologue sounds something like, "I shouldn't feel relieved about this." People who actually care don't feel relieved, but the relief is there, and it keeps coming back. This is one of the earliest and most consistent markers of eco-burnout. Not the relief itself, but the layered suffering of feeling relief and then punishing yourself for it. The concern was so tightly fused to your sense of who you are that the absence of it, even briefly, reads as a betrayal of yourself. If that's familiar, that's sign 1. Sign 2. Cynicism that doesn't feel like clarity. There's a version of individual action is insufficient that is analytically sound. The research supports meaningful limits on what individual consumption changes can accomplish at scale. That's a real finding, and understanding it is useful. But there's a different version. And this one feels different from the inside. It's the version where nothing feels like it matters. Not individual action, not systemic action, not voting, not organizing, not anything. It arrives as a kind of flatness. Not as intellectual clarity, but as absence. The difference is this: genuine analytical clarity about systemic constraints still leaves you with somewhere to go. It redirects. It points toward collective action, civic engagement, different leverage points. The cynicism of burnout doesn't redirect. It just stops. Everything stops feeling like it leads anywhere. If the nothing matters feeling has stopped being an argument and started being a floor, that's sign 2. Sign 3, the performed caring. This one is quieter and harder to catch. The behaviors are still there. The reusable bags, the reduced meat, the checking of labels. The external architecture of the eco-conscious life is intact, but the connection to why has gone. There is a specific quality to action that is no longer tethered to meaning. It feels slightly hollow, slightly automatic, like a habit that has outlasted the intention that created it. You're still doing the things. You've just stopped feeling anything about them. The gap between the behavior and the feeling behind it has quietly widened into something you can notice. This is one of the more disorienting signs, because it looks like function from the outside. It passes. People around you probably don't notice, but from the inside, there's a sense of going through motions in a performance where you've forgotten what the performance was for. If the doing is still happening, but the caring behind it has gone quiet, that's sign 3. Sign 4. Avoidance that isn't self-protection. There's a healthy version of limiting climate content consumption. It is deliberate, boundaried, and chosen. You decide not to read the news after 9 p.m. You decide to skip a particular documentary because you know what it will cost you right now. It's an active decision made from self-knowledge. The burnout version is different. It's not a decision. It's an absence of motivation to engage at all. The documentary sits unwatched, not because you consciously chose not to watch it, but because reaching for it requires something you don't currently have. The newsletter sits unread, not as a boundary, but as a thing you keep meaning to get to and somehow never do. The distinction matters because one is self-care and one is withdrawal. And withdrawal, the quiet retreat from the thing you used to need to engage with, is a consistent marker of burnout in any domain. If the avoidance feels less like protection and more like absence, that's sign 4. Sign 5, the news that no longer lands. This one is perhaps the most alarming from the inside. There was a time when a particular kind of climate news, a temperature record, a species listed, a glacier gone, would land in a specific way, not just as information. As something felt, at some point that stopped. The headline registers, the information is processed, and then nothing, or something much smaller than what used to be there. The desensitization is real, and it is a documented feature of sustained exposure to distressing information without adequate processing or recovery time. It is the nervous system doing something protective, but from the inside, it feels like evidence of the worst fear, that the caring has gone and might not come back. If the things that used to move you have stopped moving you, not because they became less serious, but because something in you has gone quiet, that's sign 5. And if you recognized yourself in more than one of those, probably more than 2, that recognition is not a verdict, it is a diagnosis. And diagnoses are useful because they point toward what actually helps. Now the part that most content skips, not just what the signs are, but why this happens. Because without the mechanism, the recovery steps are just instructions, and instructions without understanding are very hard to sustain. Here is the core mechanism of eco-burnout, stated as plainly as possible. Climate anxiety, by its nature, asks you to sustain peak emotional engagement with a crisis that has no resolution timeline you will live to see fully. It is not a finite emergency with a visible end. It is a decades-long civilization-scale process that will ask something of you every single day for the rest of your life. Most of the tools offered for engaging with that reality, more information, more action, higher awareness, more consistency, are tools designed for sprint distances. They work for a while, and then the person running them hits a wall, because no human system is designed to maintain peak intensity indefinitely. The research on burnout across domains consistently shows that it is not caused by working hard or caring deeply. It is caused by the sustained mismatch between demand and recovery, between what is asked of the system and what the system is given to replenish itself. In the eco-burnout context, the specific mismatch looks like this. The demand is constant. The crisis doesn't pause. The news doesn't stop. The weight doesn't lift. The recovery was never built in, because the culture of environmental concern, in many of its forms, treats recovery as suspect. Resting feels like not caring. Pacing feels like privilege. Imperfection feels like proof you were never serious. So the engine runs, and runs, and runs, without refueling, without permission to slow down, until it stops. Not because the person stopped caring, because no engine runs indefinitely without fuel. The numbness is not the death of the concern. It is the protective response of a system that has been running on empty for longer than it should have. The nervous system doing the only thing it can do when the demand finally exceeds the available capacity. You didn't lose your values. You lost your pace. Those are not the same loss. That distinction between losing your values and losing your pace is the emotional center of this video. Because what you do with "I lost my values" is grieve and question your character. What you do with "I lost my pace" is recover and recalibrate. Those are very different things to do, and only one of them is accurate to what actually happened. So, what actually helps? Not a 10-step program, not a return to peak intensity dressed up as recovery. 3 specific things, each one targeting a different part of the mechanism that produced the burnout. The first is redefining what engagement looks like from here. The version of eco-engagement that burned you out probably had a particular shape: high information load, consistent action pressure, identity heavily fused to consistency, guilt as the primary engine of behavior. That shape is not the only shape engagement can take. And it is almost certainly not the shape that will be sustainable for the next decade. The research on sustained pro-social engagement in climate work and in other domains consistently points towards something that looks less like constant peak involvement and more like committed, paced, boundaried participation with explicit permission to rest, without it meaning abandonment. What this means practically: choosing 1 or 2 areas of engagement and going deeper rather than trying to cover everything. Building in deliberate recovery, not as failure, but as maintenance. And releasing the idea that the quality of your concern is measured by its constancy. Constancy is a sprint metric. This is a marathon. The second is separating the concern from the guilt. This is harder and slower, and it matters more than almost anything else in this list. The guilt that has been functioning as the engine of eco-engagement is not actually what makes the engagement real. The concern is what makes it real. The guilt is just the accelerant, and accelerants burn fast and leave things depleted. What it looks like in practice to separate the two. When you notice the guilt arriving, the guilt about the plastic bag, the flight, the relief, try naming it as distinct from the concern. The concern says, "This matters to me." The guilt says, "You are failing it." Those are different sentences. They produce different behavior. One produces sustainable engagement, the other produces burnout. The concern is still there, underneath the depletion. The fact that you're watching this video, that you recognized yourself in those 5 signs, that you're still asking the question of what comes next, that is the concern. Still present. Quieter than it used to be, but present. The concern is not gone. It is resting inside an exhausted system. That is recoverable. The third is taking the smallest possible next step, and only that. One of the mechanisms of burnout recovery that appears consistently across domains is the value of re-engagement through minimum viable action. Not because small actions change the world, but because they rebuild the neural pathway between intention and behavior that burnout severs. The goal right now is not impact. The goal is reconnection. What that might look like is different for everyone. For some people, it's returning to a single practice that used to feel meaningful. For others, it's one conversation, one article, one evening with a community of people who share this. For others, it's simply allowing themselves to feel the concern again, even a small version of it, without immediately demanding that the feeling produce action. The point is not to rebuild everything at once. The point is to find the thread, the smallest piece of the original concern that still feels real, and to hold it. Without pressure, without sprint energy, just, here is what I care about. I'm still here. I'm not gone. That is enough to start from. What was the moment you realized what you were feeling was exhaustion and not indifference? And what did that recognition change, if anything? So here is where things actually stand. Eco-burnout is real. It is distinct from eco-anxiety, distinct from general burnout, and distinct from the thing you were probably afraid it was evidence that you never really cared. It is the predictable outcome of sustained peak engagement with an open-ended crisis inside a culture of environmental concern that built no permission for recovery into its architecture. It happened to you not because you were weak, or shallow, or performing. It happened because you were running the wrong engine for the length of the race. The 5 signs you looked at in this video are not a diagnosis of failure. They are a map of where you are, And maps are useful precisely because they tell you where you are, which is the first thing you need to know before you can figure out where to go next. The numbness is not the end of the concern. The cynicism is not the truth about what's possible. The performed caring is not evidence that the real caring was never there. These are the signs of a system that ran too hard for too long without adequate fuel or permission to rest. And systems like that, given the right conditions, recover, not as reassurance, as a more accurate description of your actual situation. The concern is not gone. It is depleted and quiet and waiting for conditions it can sustain. Your job right now is not to restore the intensity. It is to restore the conditions. Smaller, more boundaried, more honest about what one person can carry and what one person needs to put down in order to keep going. You didn't lose your values when the feeling went quiet. You lost your pace. Those are not the same loss. And pace, unlike values, is something you can recalibrate. Not all at once, not perfectly, but honestly, and with time, and with the understanding that sustainable engagement with something that matters is worth more than peak engagement that burns out and leaves the field empty. Imperfect and coherent. Still here. That is more than enough to work with.